From terrible to good, from mid to great, and from great to mid, we're going to cover McLaren, Aston Martin, and Ferrari and their major swings of 2023.
Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to another episode of Turn 1 Podcast. We're your hosts, Jeremiah
and Thomas.
As I said in the intro, we're going to go over the major swings of 2023 between McLaren, Ferrari, and Aston Martin, starting with Aston Martin. So, what do you think? Anything?
I think you've got a lot to cover here, but by far the biggest shot coming into the season, especially if you didn't watch a lot of the build-up, right? If you didn't watch a lot of the preseason testing, if you didn't read the reports that were coming out, I was a skeptic. I will own that. You tried to beat it into me that they were going to be awesome, at least the first couple races of the year. I didn't buy it, but how'd they look the first half of the season or so?
Well, considering Fernando Alonso had a podium in 6 of the first 8 races, I would say pretty well, but we're going to talk about kind of why that is. First of all, Fernando Alonso. So when you're bringing a big powerhouse team or name like that to a team, you got to understand that that's going to come with some different innuendos, and that's that he's going to bring everything possible out of whatever car you bring, no matter how good it is, how bad it is, which in their case happened to be a great car. Now, granted, it's pretty much exactly the 2022 Red Bull car, but it worked. So with them starting out strong, they had the new team hires, brought in a bunch of people from a bunch of different teams, especially from Red Bull, brought in a couple of those guys. They brought in, Lawrence Stroll brought in a whole bunch of money so that they could have a brand new factory that was built out in Silverstone. Now, I wasn't ready immediately off the jump, but they were eventually able to move into that. And they're building a new wind tunnel. That happened throughout the season as well. So that's now going to be a part of their new facility out there. But with Fernando Alonso, he's going to bring everything possible out of that car. Now, since Red Bull was able to bring a lot of different things from their 2022 car to 2023, that's why they still had that advantage out there. But as you can plainly see, none of the cars from any of the teams in 2023 could compete with last year's Red Bull, considering that's exactly what Aston Martin brought. And I just think it's incredible. Now, the reason why they go from strong to weak in the end, and not even really weak, more like middle of the pack, but the reason why is because the upgrades that they brought did not work in the way that they thought that they were going to work. So they thought that it was going to have way more pace unlocked and they were going to be fighting back up at the top, but they just were not able to keep the pace of the McLaren upgrades, the Ferrari upgrades, and the Mercedes upgrades. And obviously Red Bull still dominated out up front, so they weren't able to bring their car up to par with Red Bull.
You know, so obviously they had the first half of the season. I'm not going to debate you on the bad or mid of the pack, back half of the season. But we did see the last 3 races, they did okay. They had something go right the last 3 races of the year where they were getting top 10 finishes. And, of course, Alonso got that the third spot at Sao Paulo.
In
maybe.
Brazil.
And so, I mean, I find it interesting. They had the new factory built this year, right? And I was trying to find the exact day they moved in. We'd always heard May of 23. It was actually the end of May of 2023 they moved in. About the same time their results fell off.
Well, you don't just hop into a brand new facility and immediately start busting out upgrades. It's not how it works. You have to get an understanding, a familiarity between everything. All the different parts of the factory have to talk and communicate. So you got to get fluid in that kind of act. But the fact that they have that facility going forward into 2024 makes me really happy, especially considering they were able to go from 7th place in the Constructors Championship last year to 4th this year. That's remarkable. Wasn't it 4th? 5th?
Yeah.
Yeah, fifth behind McLaren.
Yep.
Remarkable.
Just for some background on kind of my F1 fandom, we started with Drive to Survive, and one of the reasons I became a Red Bull fan, two big reasons I became a Red Bull fan. One, I don't care about Red Bull the company at all. They do some cool stuff like as Red Bull, but I don't drink Red Bull energy. I don't know if I've ever had a Red Bull energy drink. It's nothing about that. It was two things. It was Max Verstappen, because I liked the young gunslinger going out there tearing it up. He wasn't a champion yet. He wasn't anywhere near being a champion when I first started liking it. But I was like, this is the kid I want to follow. And then they had that technical partnership with Aston Martin. And Aston Martin has always been my favorite car brand, a performance car, luxury car, whatever you want to call it. It's always been my favorite. They're handmade in England. The guy that makes the engine hand signs it into the metal plaque, and it's a whole thing that I love everything about it. And they had their logo on that Red Bull car. If you remember, the little Aston Martin Red Bull.
Yeah.
Of course, that went away, and Red Bull's changed technical partners a few times. But that was the number two reason that I became a Red Bull fan, was because I was like, Aston Martin's involved? Yeah, I'm loving it. Red Bull all the way. It's Aston Martin. And so whenever they kind of broke off and did their own thing, I've been rooting for them from the start. And you see the Lawrence Stroll and the Lance Stroll angle, and you're like, okay, that's a little bit of a damper on the whole thing. And then they come into this season, and you're like, they figured it out. Lawrence spent money. He bought the right people. He bought the right parts. He got Alonso in there to tear things up. Like, they pieced it together. And I'm hopeful that they will continue their rise. Now, the only roadblock that they're going to hit, I think you hinted on this in a previous show. If I can find it, I'll link it, whichever one it was. They brought over a lot of engineers from other teams, right? They brought over like the number 2 guy from several different teams and their different specializations and categories. And we saw their car fall off when the other teams brought upgrades. Are those guys able to go into a brand new season with a brand new car that is theirs and it compete? Or is that decline going to keep happening because they didn't get the number 1 guy from any team? They got a bunch of number 2 guys. So do these number 2 guys step up and be new superstars in the sport, or does that decline keep ticking down?
You're right. I did hint at this, and the point that I was making was that it's not their original idea. It was basically learned traits from somebody else's idea. So the whole big question mark here is, are they going to be able to come up with their own ideas, their own philosophies, and bring it to the car, and not just, oh, I brought this along from where I came from kind of thing.
It'll be interesting to see. I guess we'll have to really watch the preseason testing. We'll have to see what the team is saying about their... Now, they're going to have this whole offseason in the new facility. So theoretically speaking, they should have a ton of data on that car to roll out. They should know way more in advance of the start of the season what kind of upgrades they're going to need, because every team comes into the season knowing what their deficiencies are. They just might not know what the other teams are going to excel at yet. So they start working on their upgrade packages before the season even starts. And so with a new factory, with all the bells and whistles and gadgets, you should be able to piece together a winning car. Now, do they compete with McLaren? I don't know. Do they compete with Ferrari? I don't know. That is really tough to break into that echelon of the sport and stay there. That's next level.
I'm going to make a prediction now, just based on how the end of the season kind of went for them. I'm going to say they're no longer in the echelon of racing with Haas and the Williams and the Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri, and they're now 1-1 with probably Alpine. Now, as it ended last year, they had the edge on Alpine by, significant amount per se. Yeah. But as far as, okay, level ground, here's Alpine, here's Aston Martin, I think they're going to be pretty much competing with each other. Maybe Aston Martin's still going to have the advantage. We'll see. I don't know what the season's going to bring. That's just my prediction.
Well, and the last thing that they're going to have to combat, so with all the eyes on Formula One now, you have the 4 teams that I think financially are solid no matter what happens. You have Red Bull, Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren, which are just always going to be there, right? They're always going to be... They're the Yankees. They're the Red Sox. They're fine. You have Alpine, though, and now Aston Martin, which I will agree with. They're kind of in the same tier, if you will. Alpine's got a lot of big people coming in.
And a lot of money coming in.
Alpine's got a lot of money, a lot of eyes. They're probably going to have a docu-series on them coming out, knowing Ryan Reynolds and how he does stuff. That is going to make the competition for the midfield that much more intense. And that only puts more pressure on your top three teams of Ferrari, Mercedes, and Red Bull to continue their dominance. So it's not like Formula One was 4 or 5 years ago, where you had one or two top teams, 6 midfield teams, and then 2 trash teams. There's a lot of moving in and out of that midfield team. Like it's crazy competition now, which is exciting.
Yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes. We'll move right into Ferrari. I'll have my
Yeah.
1 point for them, and then I'll let you kind of take the reins on this one because I know that that's the team that you've been dying to talk about. As far as Ferrari goes, the only point that I really want to make sure that's hammered in here is the fact that there is an interview out there of Charles Leclerc talking about how he had no idea essentially how to control this 2023 Ferrari car. Now, you and I both know, and hopefully so do our listeners, that if your driver does not understand how to work the car, there is zero possibility of him getting the absolute limit out of that car. He'll still be fast. Don't get me wrong. He's a Formula One driver and one of the best, especially Charles Leclerc himself. But if you don't have an exact understanding of the limit capabilities of that car, you will not push that car to its limits. So even if the car might be a little bit faster, you're not going to get the same results out of it. And that's why we got to see a lot of Carlos Sainz this year in his kind of, I guess you could say, reign at Ferrari, as he was the number one go-to, just because he had a better understanding of that car and he was able to get more out of it than Charles Leclerc.
We've seen this now 2 seasons in a row from Ferrari where they struggle with their car, and they replaced I can't even think of his name now. What was the team principal's name?
Matteo Binotto.
They replaced him because we thought, I mean, I did at least, he's the problem, right? He was like an engineer guy. He did really good at that. He just couldn't piece the whole team together because their strategy was so bad.
I thought that was a dumb idea to let him go. He's literally the brains behind their comeback in that car.
And he might have been, but again, their strategy was awful. So even if he had the car part figured out, he didn't have the strategy part figured out. So they bring in old Fred Vasseur, and it's kind of the same story at Ferrari. Now this year you don't have all the strategical errors. It's not dumb mistakes like you saw a lot the last year, but it was just a lot of inconsistency on track. They would go to a race where they would be top 3 cars, and then they'd go the very next weekend and be a 9-10 car. And it just didn't make any sense why they couldn't get the car ready to go on race day, or if they just didn't have the right setup or they didn't plan for it. So, we talked about Aston Martin, how in the first, 8 races, they had 6 podiums, right? Flip over to Ferrari, the first 9 races, you have 2 podiums.
Jeez. From
by Charles Leclerc.
From Ferrari.
And this is coming off of a season where for 2/3 of the season, half of the season, they were fighting for a championship last year. Now, again, Red Bull was running away with it a little bit, but they were in the fight until about 2/3 in the season when Red Bull finally kind of put their foot on the gas and leaped ahead. Charles was up there in points with Max. Like, it was a battle. And so you come into this season and you're like, okay, Ferrari's taken that step over Mercedes. They're going to be competing with Red Bull. And okay, let's rule out Red Bull. They come to the season, they dominate. Sure, that checks out. You would expect Ferrari, though, to be right there behind them in number 2, and they weren't. They were behind Mercedes. They were behind Aston Martin for a long time this year. They were behind those 2 teams, and you're like, Ferrari went from being a solid number 2 in the standings to fighting for 4th. Ferrari.
Well, the thing is that last year we saw they were competing for that drivers' championship and constructors' championship, but the main reason why they had to give that up is because you saw all these engines blowing here and car failing here, and the reason why is because their durability was just not good. So in terms of when you think about the engine power, they had the power cranked up all the way, just like it should be for race day and everything like that. But the car was failing. It was not capable of riding at that full power. So for the rest of the season, and you can tell exactly when it happens, but there is a period, there is a race where all of a sudden they stopped competing with Red Bull, and that's because they had to turn the power down on the engines so that they didn't blow for the rest of the season. I mean, they're starting to worry about different parts and collecting penalties. You're talking about grid place penalties to start races. So yeah, of course they had to turn down the power of the car because their durability is not there. So to your point, you think, well, rolling into 2023, what are the things you have to fix? Strategy, durability, and they come into the season and what do they fix? I guess durability, but where's all that engine power that they had? Maybe that's something to do with the floor not being as aerodynamic in terms of like what the Red Bull's producing. Maybe it has something to do with the DRS. I personally don't know, just because that's not my forte in terms of knowing all the technicalities of that. But you really expected them to at least be the second best car, like you said, and they just was not that.
So on the flip side, it's not all negative at Ferrari. Yeah, I had it click in my head the other day. I was like, man, we bash teams a lot. We should probably talk them up a little bit when they do things the right way. So it's not all negative. So the back half of the year, the final 9 races, I know I skipped a few in the middle, but just to keep it even, the first, I did, they had 2 podiums in the first 9 races. In the last 9 races, they had 6 podiums. Okay, so now you're matching what Aston Martin did the first half of the season. That included a win by Carlos Sainz at where did he
Monza.
win that?
Monza.
Yeah. So it had that one. So not all bad. And then they even had they rolled up that them and Mercedes and Aston Martin all rolled out that major upgrade package at the same time, right after Monaco. And that is when Mercedes and Ferrari started pulling away from Aston Martin. And so they did something right. They got themselves back into the fight the second half of the year. They put them in a place to compete with Mercedes for that second spot. They didn't get it, but they were competing for it. And so they took notes on the first half of the year. They improved from it. It wasn't just a crap year all the way through. So you got to give them some credit for adjusting and making changes. But for context, this is Ferrari, the most dominant F1 team of all time, and they won 1 race this year. Granted, I know it's Red Bull's dream season, but you're Ferrari.
They quite literally get an absurd amount of money at the end of every single year just to keep them in Formula One.
Yeah. And they just blew it. I don't know. Maybe cost cap is hitting them hard now. Maybe they just, they can't spin like the Yankees spin. So the playing field is being leveled. But here's my last thing on Ferrari. So we talked about coming into this year, how did you think that they were going to be a clear number 2 team this year?
Yes.
Yeah. So we talked about that coming into this year. Going into 2024, I'm concerned for them being the number 3 team. Because now McLaren's got things in the works. McLaren figured out that car this year. They locked that car in, and now they're going to be improving on it. And you've got 2 drivers that want it. We've seen Lando do his thing. We know he can be good. Don't know if he's great yet, but he can be good. And we've seen what Oscar can do in 1 year. That kid is going to win races. I don't know if he's going to be a world champion yet, as long as Max Verstappen is racing. But the second Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton are out of the sport, that dude can win a world championship.
I believe it. My last point on Ferrari is, once again, just like last year, we're sitting here at the end of 2023, feeling upbeat about how the season ended and expecting the world from them in 2024. I guess we'll see how it turns out. I mean, we were let down going into this season. Hopefully it'll be better for them, at least at the start. Hopefully they're at least competing for second and not like way at the back like they were at the beginning of this season. I would like to see them at least competing for second off the jump and not making it like a last second race. Oh, if he gets ahead and we give George Russell 5 seconds, we give Sergio Perez the lead in front of George Russell, and none of that. I want to see them actually competing for it.
And I don't think Alpine's going to be up there next year. I think it's going to take a little bit for them to get the money rolling in to turn around Alpine. But the 2 biggest things are going to be McLaren and Aston Martin. If Lawrence Stroll keeps pumping money into Aston Martin and McLaren keeps up their upward trajectory, they're going to be in a fight for third. It's not going to be guaranteed at all.
Speaking of McLaren, it was not a good start for them either.
But they had 25 pit stops in the first race.
So you had the 5 pit stops for Lando Norris in the first race with a hydraulic problem. Oscar Piastri was nowhere to be found, and this kind of kept up for quite a while. Basically what happened is they were caught off guard. The car that they had brought to the 2023 season did not match. Their philosophy of what the car was going to be able to do did not match when it came to the FIA's increased floor edge height to 15 millimeters, the new rule change that they had made. So that kind of just threw them out to the wind. Their design did not work. But the problem is that during testing and going into Bahrain, they figured it out, right? But the problem is they figured it out too late and they weren't able to bring the upgrades to the car immediately because no team can do that. You got to develop it, have some time in the wind tunnel just to make sure that everything's running properly and running exactly how you want it to. So they had to have some time to develop the car. So that being said, for the first few races, they were kind of nowhere to be found. In fact, they were all the way at the back, which I didn't think that was going to be how they finished the season, by no means, because it's McLaren, man. I mean, they're one of the legacy teams. Now, they're not the legacy team like Ferrari, but I mean, they've been in the sport
They're top
forever.
three if you factor in Williams.
Yeah, 100%. So the way that it worked for McLaren is they brought in these upgrades, but they brought them in kind of segments. First of all, they brought minimal upgrades to Baku, which basically just had the actual principles of what they were wanting to bring to the car, just to make sure that their designs were going to hold true. And what they saw from Baku, they liked. So they went ahead with what they were doing, kept working on the upgrades, brought it out. And in Austria, we see them roll out a brand new package. I'm talking like new floor, new side pods, a whole redesign of the car. And with these upgrades that they brought came all of this pace where they were now able to charge through the pack, and they were getting podiums. They were getting top 5 finishes regularly. And that's not just Lando. We saw Oscar Piastri up there quite a bit too. Now, the only reason Oscar Piastri falls off at the end is because as we progress through the season, you get towards the later races of the season, those races aren't in an F2 calendar. Because if you watch if you look at the F1 season as a whole, it's really the first half of the races where they'll have these feeder series, these support series come in and lay down some rubber on the track for the F1 cars. Pretty much at the end of the season, in the second half, you don't really see F2, you don't see F3, you don't see any of you don't see the Porsche Cup out there, and you don't really see them until the final race in Abu Dhabi, where you have all of them come back and they give their final hoorah. But for that whole second segment, there is no feeder series, and so therefore last year there was no Oscar Piastri. So he's pretty much going in blind for those races and doing what he could. He's still getting top 10 finishes, but you could clearly see that he was off the pace of Lando Norris because he's never driven those tracks before. He's fresh. So I'm definitely going to say that we're going to see more from him going into this next season. And like we talked about earlier, as long as they keep this upward trajectory of how they're developing this car, hopefully they'll be right on the tail of Red Bull. It's going to be really tough, to your credit from earlier, it's going to be really tough for teams like Ferrari to keep up with McLaren, because even Mercedes was really struggling to keep up with McLaren. It was pretty much McLaren over both of them. Now, Mercedes did come back and they did have a good fight there at the end where McLaren kind of seemed like they were weaker, but that could have just been that the track didn't really suit their car that well. But I am really curious to see how this next season is going to roll with the likes of Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren. And even more so, how close those three are going to be to Red Bull, and if this is going to be a 4-way fight for the Constructors' Cup.
So, looking at their results for the year, Jeremiah touched on their struggles early on. Their first 8 races, 5 top 10 finishes. Top 10 finishes, 5
and that's
times.
like getting 10th.
Yes. But hey, you go to the back half of the year, the final 8 races, they had 7 podiums.
Gosh.
Even for Oscar not really knowing what was going on. Now, granted, he did kind of struggle in the last 4, but he got a 2 spot and a 3 spot in Japan and Qatar. They had 2 double points finishes, Japan and Qatar. You thought that they were going on a roll, and they kind of were, because again, Lando goes 2, 2, 3, 2, 5, 2. That is a great way to finish off a season when you started 17, 17, 6, 9, 17.
We had a rookie, Oscar Piastri, winning a sprint race in Qatar. Yep. That was ridiculous, especially considering where that team started.
Fighting with Max Verstappen multiple times throughout the season, Oscar Piastri was. And we were like, dude, back off. You're Oscar Piastri. He didn't back off. And you know what? We saw Oscar Piastri, I want to say, at the Netherlands. We saw him earlier in the season that do something with Max Verstappen, but we saw him go wheel to wheel with Verstappen at the Netherlands, I think, for a long time. And then they did it again in Spa. Maybe that was the first time we saw it. He's not afraid. And then we saw it again in the sprint race that he won, too. He was battling with Verstappen, and I was like, this kid has it. That is, I'll be honest, that is one thing I haven't seen from Lando Norris, is that moment of he's got it. He knows exactly what to do. And maybe that's because Lando hasn't had a chance yet. It's just situational, right? It's purely situational. But man, I'm excited for that team.
You know that I'm a Lando Norris team rider, man. I will forever be a
Yeah.
Lando Norris team rider. So I can't agree with you on that point. I just feel like he hasn't
I'm
been
not saying
given.
he's not great. I just said I haven't seen that moment. The way that I saw Oscar battle the Verstappen this year, I have not seen that in Lando's 4 seasons or whatever now.
We saw Lando Norris start at the back of the pack and work his way all the way up the pack, passing Oscar Piastri and finishing that race in the top 5. So I can't say I agree with you, man. I think Lando Norris just needs to be given the opportunity. And if McLaren keeps their ways going into the next season, I think we're going to see more from Lando Norris than everybody's been giving him credit for these past few seasons.
He just needs to flip one of those 6 second place finishes into a win. Like, that will elevate him so much in the world of F1. To be a Grand Prix winner, you take elite status when you win a race.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
think about Pierre Gasly. Now, no one thinks that he's an awesome driver, but he's got a race win.
He does.
And that propels him into another category driver. Back when Sergio was on Force India and won a race, you were like, whoa.
That's one of the reasons Red Bull signed him. Yeah.
Yeah, it just takes you in that whole other sphere. And I know he's already locked down as McLaren's guy, but they will cement him in that team if he gets a race win this next year.
Well, George Russell won his first race in what was Brazil last year, right? Correct me if I'm
Something
wrong.
like that.
I'm pretty sure nearing the end of the season, I want to say it was Brazil, that George Russell finally got his first race win, which takes him to the next tier. It really does. And now you're kind of putting him in that conversation of, oh, him and Lewis are going to be going back to back every season. But nobody puts Lando in that conversation just because of the fact that he hasn't gotten that race win yet. When arguably the two are pretty much on par, if not one of them having a slight edge over the other. You can decide on who's who in that.
Let's wrap up with this. The 3 teams that we've talked about today, Aston, Ferrari, McLaren, where do you see them finishing next year? Not really knowing anything about what they're doing on this offseason.
This is tough to me. I'm going to go in terms of, I can't really put them in terms of like the other cars or the other teams, but I'll compare them against the 3. I'm going to say McLaren's going to be over Ferrari. I'm going to say Aston Martin's going to be below Ferrari. So I'm going to say it's going to go McLaren, Ferrari, Aston Martin. Now, I feel like they're going to be close, and I'm hoping that Aston Martin comes back, brings the fight back that they had at the beginning of the season, and they're going to be really in this mix. And I'm hoping that they're really only going to have a few points separating all 3 of them, because that's always exciting. But in terms of the final finish, I'm going to put McLaren over Ferrari, and I'm going to put Aston Martin coming in the rear, unfortunately.
I agree with your order. Dude, I think there's a chance McLaren flips Mercedes. Mercedes struggled. This was not a clean year by Mercedes.
No, but if you look at their year in 2022, they took leaps and bounds from that year. And you got to assume they're going to do the same.
But George is a wild card.
I would agree with that.
I mean, Lewis is going to be Lewis. Don't be wrong. They're going to get a ton of points no matter what, right? They're Mercedes. They have Toto. They have the car. They have the resources. They have Lewis. George isn't a bad driver, but we've seen 2 versions of George now.
Yep.
Last year, he was Mr. Consistency, and he was a guaranteed top 5. Like, you could bet money every single race he was going to finish in the top 5, and you would have a ton of money at the end of the year. This year, if you followed that same strategy, you'd be broke 3 races in. The dude couldn't finish. And when I look at McLaren on the rise, they were consistent the back half of the year. Oscar had his issues on the tracks that he wasn't too familiar with, but the car improved. The car was reliable. The car was quick in every type of race. The car was quick in speed tracks, in high aero tracks. It was quick in Vegas. That's what you want to see out of a team. Like, that's the opposite. That's the antithesis of Ferrari, right? Ferrari had a car that was so hit or miss depending on what situation you put it in. McLaren developed through the season a car that they knew would work. And we heard from McLaren early on in the season. Remember, they were interviewing Zach Brown, Miami-ish. I want to say it was the U.S. I just picture it was in the U.S. So maybe Miami, when they were really struggling, they went like 17-19 Miami, and they were like, what's your outlook on the season? And that's when I was like, Zach Brown's got to be fired, fire everybody at McLaren, clean house. Tell me I'm not wrong, right? When they finished 17-19 in Miami and they have like 3 points for the year on race 6, clean house, you're McLaren. And he said, we've got some stuff in the works. We're really excited about our upgrade packages. We're going to be competing at the end of the year. And I was like, are you insane, dude? No, you're not. And sure enough, a couple weeks later, they roll out their upgrade package. Lando gets 4th in Austria. They go 2 and 4 at Silverstone. They go 2 and 5 in Hungary. He gets 7th in Belgium. They turned it around, and he saw that coming. So when they came into the season with that car, they knew something was off. I don't think they knew exactly what was off, but they knew something was off. Kind of, you hinted at it, right? It didn't fit what they needed it to do. They figured it out, and that's what you want a team. And now they've got the two. I mean, if you're building an F1 team and you can have your pick of any two drivers, there's a pretty good chance you're picking both of theirs, outside of Max Verstappen, of course.
Yeah, so to your point, if Lando's going to be Lando and Lewis Hamilton's going to be Lewis Hamilton, then the two wild cards in that scenario are going to be Oscar Piastri and George Russell. Now, if what it boils down to in that factor is experience on Oscar's side, you can guarantee that gets better for next year. He's going to get more time on the exact same tracks. He's going to get more familiarity. He'll get faster. But if your wild card on George Russell is what kind of driver is he going to be? What's his driving style going to be? That's a problem, because we did not complain about Oscar Piastri in terms of what he was going to bring to every race. We knew what he was going to bring. He was going to bring this fluid motion where he's able to get overtakes whenever he needs to, stay out of trouble whenever he needs to. With George Russell, you couldn't say the same. So if that's the case, then the wild card really comes down to George Russell, because Oscar Piastri is going to get that experience. But what is George Russell going to do with his driving style next year?
And if I'm Toto, I'll give George 3 races of free reign. George, you want to go be aggressive? You want to say that you're a championship driver? You got 3 races. Put it in the top 3 every single time, and you can keep doing it. But if he does that mess where he DNFs, retires, crashes, hits somebody, and drops back 10 places like he has this season,
his own teammate.
If he does that in the first 3 races, George, you're going back to Mr. Consistency. Just get a top 5 finish. Don't be aggressive. Don't take chances. Don't do anything like that. Get a top 5 finish, because at that point for Mercedes, let Lewis do the championship level driving. You get points. That's what Red Bull did last year and this year. Now, granted, Sergio had a little bit of a dip this year, but it was always Max, go win the race. Sergio, get top 5 points, and we will blow everybody out of the water.
And they did.
All right, guys, let us know in the comments how you think Aston, Ferrari, and McLaren are going to stack up next year. We are excited to see your predictions.
Guys, if you think Oscar Piastri leaves McLaren, goes to Williams, and takes them to the top, I'm right there with you, and I want to see it.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye, guys.